The hum of the servers was a constant, low thrum against my eardrums, a sound I'd lived with for so long it felt like my own heartbeat. I ran a hand over my thinning hair, the rough stubble of familiar discomfort against my palm. Another Tuesday. Another endless string of data points marching across the screen, each one as meaningless as the last. The vastness of the universe, once a source of wonder, now felt like a particularly dull textbook. I used to dream of charting nebulae, of finding the echoes of creation. Now I just charted atmospheric interference. My office at the radio telescope installation, signal received not from space, was a shrine to my faded ambitions. Stacks of old journals, dog-eared and faded, leaned precariously against the walls. A dusty telescope model, a gift from my younger, more hopeful self, sat on my desk, its polished brass dulled by neglect. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and ozone, a scent that clung to my clothes, my skin, my very soul. I traced a crack in the linoleum floor with the toe of my worn boot. Years ago, this place had pulsed with a different energy. Colleagues, their faces alive with the thrill of discovery, would gather in the common room, their voices a chorus of theories and equations. Now the common room was mostly empty, the chairs gathering dust. Most of them had moved on, chasing funding, chasing accolades, chasing whatever it was that made I forget the sheer, crushing indifference of the cosmos. I'd stayed. Stubbornness, maybe. Or perhaps just a profound lack of anywhere else to go. My fingers danced across the keyboard, a practiced, almost mindless rhythm. The primary array was sweeping sector Gamma-7, a particularly uninspiring patch of void. No pulsars, no quasars, just the faint whisper of background radiation. It was the sort of place I'd send the instruments when I had nothing else to point them at. A cosmic waiting room. Then it happened, a flicker. A deviation. My eyes narrowed, focusing on the anomaly. It wasn't the usual blip of cosmic noise, not a satellite passing overhead, not even the rhythmic pulse of a distant, known pulsar. This was different. It was a complex waveform, a series of repeating pulses, but with an underlying structure that defied conventional astrophysical signatures. It was like listening to a symphony played on instruments I'd never heard of, in a language I couldn't comprehend. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. The hum of the servers seemed to recede, replaced by a new, sharper awareness. My heart, that sluggish, weary organ, began to beat with a forgotten urgency. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't interference. This was a signal. My hands, usually so steady, trembled as I initiated a more focused scan. The coordinates were precise, unnervingly so. Sector Gamma-7, yes, but a specific point within it, a point that should have been utterly empty. I cross-referenced the orbital paths of all known satellites, checked the historical logs for any recorded transmissions from that region. Nothing. The space where the signal originated was as blank as a freshly wiped slate. But this felt wrong. The regularity of the pulses, the intricate patterns within them spoke of an intelligence, a deliberate transmission, but from where? And why here in this barren corner of the sky? I brought up the spectrographic analysis. The frequencies were unusual, shifting in a way that suggested a complex modulation. It was too structured to be natural, too deliberate. My mind, long accustomed to the predictable dance of celestial bodies, struggled to grasp the implications. The signal wasn't just a curiosity, it felt like a statement, a message. My gaze drifted to the dusty telescope model on my desk. The idealism it represented felt like a relic from another lifetime. I'd always believed that if we looked hard enough, listened closely enough, we'd find something out there. But the thought that had always accompanied that belief was a comforting one, that whatever we found would be comprehensible, a reflection of ourselves, albeit on a grander scale. This signal, this felt like it was from something else entirely, something that didn't play by our rules. I zoomed in on the source location, the digital representation of empty space stark on my monitor. The signal's strength was remarkably consistent, unwavering. It wasn't fading, wasn't drifting. It was there, a persistent, insistent presence. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. What was broadcasting from a point of absolute nothingness? Another Tuesday. Another endless string of data points marching across the monitors. Except this Tuesday was different. This Tuesday was wrong. The anomaly hadn't just persisted, it had intensified. The signal, a whisper at first, was now a persistent murmur, a low-frequency throb that seemed to resonate not just in the control room of the radio telescope installation. Signal received not from space, but deep within my bones. I'd spent the last 24 hours glued to my terminal, the lukewarm coffee doing little to combat the creeping exhaustion. My eyes burned, dry and gritty, but I couldn't pull away. Not when the data was screaming such an impossible story. It wasn't just the frequency. That was the first bizarre thing. It was too stable, too pure for any natural celestial phenomenon. Stellar radiation flickers. Pulsars stutter. Nebulae emit a chaotic symphony of frequencies. This, however, was a single, unwavering note. But the real impossibility, the one that made my gut clench with a dread I couldn't articulate, was the origin. The arrays designed to pinpoint the faintest whispers from the void were pointing nowhere. Not up, not out, but inwards, or rather, downwards. The triangulation software, which had performed flawlessly for years, was spitting out coordinates that corresponded to a point deep beneath the very ground I stood on. It was absurd. A technical glitch, surely. A phantom echo bouncing off some forgotten piece of subterranean equipment. I'd run diagnostics until the system threatened to overheat. All green, all perfect. My fingers danced across the keyboard, isolating the signal, trying to break it down to find some pattern, some recognizable signature, but there was none. It was pure, unadulterated energy channeled with a precision that felt deliberate, not natural, not random. A sharp rap on the door jolted me. I flinched, my head snapping up. The door to the control room was usually a barrier against the outside world, a sanctuary of sorts. Now it felt like a flimsy shield. "Dean, I still in here." It was the site manager, a gruff, no-nonsense individual who valued efficiency and predictable outcomes above all else. He carried the scent of stale cigarette smoke and a faint metallic tang like old machinery. I cleared my throat, the sound raspy. "Yeah, just..." He squinted at the complex graphs and waveforms, his brow furrowed in mild annoyance. "Still chasing ghosts, Dean. The sun's coming up, most people are heading home." I forced a smile, a tight, unconvincing thing. "This isn't just something, sir, this is significant." I gestured to the screen, my hand trembling slightly. "The signal, it's not from space." He grunted, stepping closer. He peered at the readouts, his gaze sharp. "What do I mean, not from space? That's what this place does, Dean. We listen to space." "I know, but this signal is originating from directly beneath us. The geolocators are locked onto a point about 3 kilometers down. It's impossible, I know, but the data..." I trailed off, my voice catching. The impossibility of it was what made it so terrifying. The site manager snorted, a sound devoid of humor. He tapped a thick finger on the monitor displaying the triangulation data. "Faulty sensor, or maybe a seismic event we missed. This old installation has its quirks." "I've checked everything," I insisted, my voice rising. "Every sensor, every calibration, there's no seismic activity, no equipment malfunction. This is a clean, coherent signal, and it's there." I pointed to the spot on the map, a sterile red marker indicating the point deep underground. He leaned back, crossing his arms. The muscles in his forearms bulged beneath his worn work shirt. His expression was one of weary skepticism, the kind I'd seen directed at my more outlandish theories before. "Dean, we're a radio telescope installation. We don't dig holes in the ground looking for whatever I think I've found. We point our dishes at the sky. But what if the sky is looking back from beneath our feet?" The words were out before I could stop them. I immediately regretted the dramatic phrasing. It sounded like something from one of those pulpy science fiction novels I used to read as a kid. He didn't laugh. He just stared at me, his eyes unreadable. The silence stretched, filled only by the relentless hum of the machines. It was a sound that had always been comforting, a testament to human ingenuity. Now it felt like a cage, trapping me with this impossible discovery. "I've been working too hard, Dean," the site manager said finally, his tone softening slightly, but the skepticism remained, a thick, suffocating blanket. "Go home, get some rest. We'll look at it again tomorrow with fresh eyes." He turned to leave, but I couldn't let it go, not yet. "Sir, if it's not space and it's not seismic, then what is it?" He paused at the doorway, his back to me. He didn't turn around. The air in the control room of the radio telescope installation, signal received, not from space, was thick with the stale scent of coffee and ozone. I hadn't slept. Sleep felt like a betrayal, a surrender to the mundane when the universe had just whispered something so profoundly other. The hum of the servers was a low thrum beneath my skin, a constant reminder of the impossible signal I'd isolated. It wasn't from the stars. It was from here, or more precisely, from directly beneath us. My fingers danced across the console, coaxing more information from the raw data. The initial analysis had been maddeningly vague, a cascade of impossibly complex waveforms that defied any known natural phenomenon. But now, with the filters I'd painstakingly crafted, something was resolving. It was like watching a fog burn off a distant horizon, revealing not land but a monstrous, unblinking eye. The signal wasn't a simple transmission. It was a resonance, a vibration that seemed to ripple through the very bedrock of the Earth. I'd cross-referenced every seismic reading, every geological survey of this remote site. Nothing. Just solid, ancient rock. Yet the signal pulsed from deep within it, a heartbeat in the planet's core. My gaze flickered to the external cameras. The vast dish of the radio telescope, usually a majestic monument to human curiosity, now felt like a crude ear pressed against a colossal, sleeping mouth. The wind howled outside, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the unsettling emptiness I felt in my gut. The data stream flickered, a sudden surge in amplitude. My breath hitched. This was it, the key. The signal was modulating. Not randomly, but with an internal logic that was both terrifyingly alien and disturbingly coherent. It was a language, not of words, but of pure, abstract concept. I felt a cold sweat prickle my brow. My hands trembled as I isolated a specific recurring pattern. It was a sequence, an index, a map, but not of space. It was a map of depth and the destination. The destination was not a point, but a state. A profound, crushing absence. It was a signature, I realized with a jolt that sent a shiver down my spine, a signature of something that existed not in dimensions we understood, but in the absence of them. It was a concept made manifest, a whisper from a place where here and there held no meaning. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes tracing the intricate fractal patterns that bloomed and receded. The signal wasn't just a transmission, it was a presence. It was a consciousness, vast and unfathomable, reaching out not with intent but with an involuntary exhalation. It was revealing itself. Or perhaps it was simply being, and we were finally sensitive enough to perceive its terrible existence. My own existence felt fragile. The weight of the discovery pressed down on me, a physical burden. I remembered the old caretaker, the one who'd warned me about the thin places in the earth. I dismissed him as a local eccentric. The patterns on the screen began to coalesce, forming something that looked architectural, but not built of stone or steel. It was a geometry of impossible angles, of structures that folded in on themselves, existing in multiple places at once. It was a city or a cathedral, or something that encompassed both and neither. And it was alive. A low grinding sound emanated from the floor beneath my feet. It was distinct from the hum of the equipment, a deep guttural groan that vibrated up through the soles of my boots. I froze, my gaze snapping from the screen to the reinforced concrete floor. Dust motes, disturbed by the tremor, danced in the dim light. The grinding intensified, a slow, agonizing scrape, as if something immense and heavy were shifting deep below. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This wasn't just data anymore. This was a physical manifestation. The signal wasn't just a waveform, it was a key unlocking something that had been dormant for eons. The ancient wrong thing I'd sensed was stirring. But what was it? And why was it beneath this specific, forgotten installation? The hum of the primary array, usually a comforting lullaby, now scraped at my nerves. It vibrated not just through the floor of the control room at the radio telescope installation. Signal received not from space but through my very bones. The stale coffee aroma was now laced with something else, something metallic and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike, but wrong, deeper. My eyes, gritty from sleeplessness, scanned the readouts. The signal. It was still there, a persistent, alien thrumming in the otherwise silent spectrum. Not just a blip, not a ghost. It was solid, and it wasn't coming from the void. It was coming from within this facility. That was the impossible part. The signal source was triangulated, its origin point a specific nondescript junction box near the old auxiliary power generator. A place I'd checked a dozen times. A place that should be dead. I pushed myself up from the worn chair, the cheap pleather groaning in protest. My limbs felt heavy, detached, as if they belonged to someone else. The long, sterile corridors of the radio telescope installation, signal received not from space, seemed to stretch and warp in my peripheral vision. Shadows clung to the corners, deeper than they should have been, pooling like spilled ink. I told myself it was fatigue, the flickering fluorescent lights playing tricks. But the metallic tang in the air was growing, and with it, a prickling sensation on my skin, like 1,000 tiny needles. I needed to see it again. The junction box. I grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam cutting a shaky path through the dimness. Each step echoed unnervingly. The usual sounds of the facility, the distant whirring of ventilation, the occasional creak of settling metal were absent, replaced by a low, resonant pulse that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It felt expectant. The auxiliary generator room was usually a forgotten corner, a place where dust bunnies gathered undisturbed. Tonight it felt charged. The junction box, a plain gray metal rectangle bolted to the concrete wall, was exactly where the triangulation had placed it. Nothing looked out of the ordinary. No scorch marks, no frayed wires, no signs of recent tampering. Just a standard, mundane piece of industrial equipment, but the signal. It was strongest here. I could almost feel it vibrating against my fingertips as I reached out, hovering inches from the cool metal. A low, guttural hum, not of electricity, but of something ancient and vast, seemed to emanate from within. My breath hitched. This wasn't a malfunction. This wasn't a prank. This was an intrusion. I fumbled for my toolkit, my hands trembling. I had to open it. I had to see what was inside. The screws were tight, resisting my efforts. As I finally managed to loosen the first screw, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floor. It wasn't the building settling. It felt deeper, more profound, like a colossal breath being drawn. Then I heard it. I froze, my heart racing. My flashlight beam snapped towards the noise. Nothing. Just cobwebs and the hulking silhouette of the dormant generator. I wrenched the cover open. Inside, there were no wires, no circuits, no obvious mechanism. The skittering sound intensified, closer now. It was no longer in the corner. It was moving. I could hear it circling just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. A dry, clicking sound accompanied the rasping, like brittle bones being ground together. My skin crawled. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this place, to pretend I'd never seen the signal, never heard the hum. But the light in the junction box, it was calling to me. It was a hunger, a curiosity that gnawed at my resolve. What was it? What was this thing that could hide in plain sight, that could manifest in such a mundane place? The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, acrid and suffocating. The pulse in the floor quickened. The skittering was directly behind me now. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting a frantic arc. And then for a fleeting, terrifying instant I saw it. Not a creature, not a shape, but a distortion. Within that distortion, 1,000 pinpricks of malevolent light flickered, too numerous to count, too alien to comprehend. You, here. My hand, still clutching the open junction box, felt numb. The light within pulsed brighter now, drawing me in. The skittering was all around me, the air grew heavy, pressing in. I was trapped. Was this what the signal had been, a lure? And if I pulled my hand away now, what would happen? Would it simply retreat, waiting? Or would it break free entirely? The pulsing light from the junction box was a sickly, unnatural green, like the phosphorescence of deep-sea decay. It didn't illuminate the cramped space of the control room. It seemed to absorb it, to pull the shadows into itself. The skittering noises, once distant, were now a frantic chorus just beyond the thin metal door. My knuckles were white where I gripped the edge of the open box. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged sound in the sudden, suffocating silence that followed the frantic scratching. It had to be the signal. It couldn't have come from that empty sector of space. Not really. The numbers, the impossible correlations, the sheer wrongness of it all, it had to be originating here. At the radio telescope installation, signal received not from space. The name itself felt like a sick joke now. My gaze flickered to the monitors. They were still cycling through the same static, the same meaningless white noise that had been their default for weeks. But now that static felt pregnant with unseen meaning, a veil over something vast and terrible. The signal had stopped, the pulsing light the only remaining evidence of its immediate presence. But it was still there. I needed to know more. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was a threat. The sheer intent I'd felt radiating from the signal, even through the sterile data streams, was undeniable. It was a consciousness, ancient and alien, and it was looking for something. Or perhaps it was already here. My mind raced, cataloging the limited resources at this remote installation. There was the main server room, of course, with its humming racks of processors. And the archives, a dusty, forgotten corner filled with analog records from the telescope's inception. Most of it was obsolete, useless. But maybe, just maybe, something had been missed. Some old logbook, some forgotten maintenance report that hinted at this. The skittering started again, louder this time, accompanied by a low, guttural scraping. It sounded like stone against stone, or something far worse, something organic and brittle being dragged across metal. I flinched, my muscles tensing. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I needed to move. Staying here, frozen in fear, would be a death sentence. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky. The green light from the junction box seemed to follow me, a malevolent eye. I backed away, my eyes never leaving the door. The scraping intensified, a rhythmic, deliberate sound. It was testing the door, trying to get in. My gaze landed on the emergency access panel near the main console. It was a heavy steel plate bolted shut, leading to the network conduits that ran beneath the facility. It was a long shot, a desperate one, but if the signal was originating from within the installation, tracing its path might reveal something. It was a physical manifestation of the signal's conduit, a tangible piece of the puzzle. I grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby toolkit. The scraping stopped. A heavy thump echoed from the other side of the door. Watching. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I turned towards the access panel. The wrench felt heavier now, imbued with a new purpose. I had to understand what was happening, what was trying to break free. This wasn't about stellar phenomena anymore. This was about survival. The bolts were thick, industrial grade. This would take time, and time was something I was rapidly running out of. As I fumbled for the correct socket wrench, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration began to hum through the floor. It wasn't the steady thrum of the generators. This was different, deeper. It felt alive. Was this what the entity wanted, to be found, to be released? And what would happen then? The green light from the junction box pulsed. Each beat sent a tremor through the floor, a low thrum that vibrated up my legs into my teeth. The skittering intensified, no longer a distant chorus but a frantic, all-consuming scramble. It was in the walls, in the conduits, in the very air I breathed, thick with the metallic tang of ozone and something else. Something like damp, disturbed earth. I pressed myself against the cold metal of the console, my grip tight where I gripped the edge, the signal. It was still coming, stronger now, a raw, untamed thing that clawed at my senses. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was a pressure, a physical weight pressing down on my skull. I could feel it behind my eyes, a phantom limb twitching. The green light flared, blinding me for a second. When my vision cleared, the skittering had stopped. An unnatural silence descended, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was my own ragged breath. Then, a new noise, a soft, wet scraping from the far corner of the room, from the shadows where the conduit opened into the wall. My gaze snapped to the sound. Nothing, just the inky blackness. But the scraping continued, slow, deliberate. It was the sound of something unfurling. I could almost taste it on my tongue, a faint, coppery sweetness like old blood. The green light pulsed again, brighter this time, and a faint shape began to coalesce in the corner. It was amorphous, indistinct, yet it had a presence, a tangible density that pushed back against the air. It was a stain spreading, a ripple in the fabric of the room. I could see faint tendrils like dark roots reaching out from it, touching the concrete floor, the metal conduit. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of this cursed radio telescope installation. Signal received, not from space. But my feet were rooted, my muscles locked in a terrible paralysis. The signal was a siren song, a terrible beauty that held me captive. It spoke of things that had no names, of distances that no instrument could measure, of a reality that was merely a thin, fragile veneer. The shape in the corner shifted, growing. It was no longer just a stain. I could see the suggestion of form, of a vast, impossibly complex geometry that my brain struggled to process. It was like looking at a fractal that was alive, constantly reconfiguring itself. A low hum started, emanating from the shape. It was the same frequency as the signal, but deeper, more resonant. It vibrated not just in my bones, but in my very soul. I felt a dizzying sense of detachment, as if my consciousness were being stretched thin, pulled away from my body. The tendrils extended further, slithering across the floor towards me. My hand instinctively went to the override switch on the main console. But the signal, it was so close to revealing everything. It was a key, and I was on the verge of turning it. What if shutting it down was the wrong choice? What if this was the only chance humanity had to understand, to prepare? Or was this the very act of understanding that would doom us all? The scraping sound returned, louder now, more insistent. It was coming from the junction box itself. The skittering was back, a frantic scrabbling, but it was no longer in the walls. It was inside the junction box. The shape in the corner pulsed, and the hum intensified. The tendrils were inches from my boots. My breath hitched. The fissure on the junction box widened, and a thin, black ichor began to seep out, dripping onto the console. It smelled acrid, like burnt sugar and something rotten. The hum stopped. The tendrils froze inches from my feet. For a single, terrifying moment, nothing moved. Then, from the fissure in the junction box, a single, thin, black filament emerged. It was impossibly fine, almost invisible, and it began to probe the air, testing, sensing. It moved with a deliberate, intelligent grace that sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. It was not just an entity. It was a consciousness, ancient and alien, and it was here. It had found its way in, not through the vastness of space, but through the very signals I had been so eager to decipher. My hand hovered over the override. The filament twitched, as if sensing my hesitation. It began to move towards me, a silent, inexorable advance. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. I could feel the room itself straining, the concrete and steel groaning under an impossible pressure. What choice did I have? Or to let it continue, to witness whatever unimaginable transformation was about to unfold and risk the annihilation of everything I knew? It was in the walls, in the conduits, in the very air I breathed. I scrambled back, my boots sliding on the slick, oily floor of the radio telescope installation. Signal received, not from space. The air here was thick, cloying, tasting of ozone and something else, something metallic and rotten. My hand, slick with sweat, fumbled for the heavy wrench I dropped earlier. It was cold, unforgiving metal, a meager comfort against the encroaching chaos. The pulsing green light seemed to mock me, a beacon in the suffocating darkness. a signal that had led me to this place. To this. The skittering grew louder, a dry, chitinous rasp that scraped against my nerves. It was no longer just in the walls, it was under the floor, beneath the very concrete I stood on. A faint, sickly luminescence began to bloom in the cracks, a phosphorescent smear that pulsed in time with the junction box. I tightened my grip on the wrench, gripped tight. My breath hitched in my chest. This wasn't a terrestrial anomaly. This was a consequence. My consequence. I chased the signal, followed its impossible trajectory, ignoring every warning, every instinct that screamed at me to stop. And now it was here, unspooling itself from the very heart of this forgotten place. The hum intensified, a deep, resonant throb that seemed to resonate not just in my bones, but in my very soul. It felt like the universe was exhaling, a slow, deliberate breath that was slowly crushing me. I had to understand. I had to see. My gaze swept the cavernous space, the hulking, silent machinery of the radio telescope installation. Now they seemed to be instruments of something far closer, something immeasurably older, being reawakened by a signal that had never truly been in space at all. The green light flickered, then died. A profound silence descended, heavier than any noise. The skittering stopped. The thrumming ceased. For a heartbeat, I thought it was over. Then a single, impossibly loud crack echoed from the far end of the main hall. It wasn't the sound of metal or concrete. It was the sound of something tearing. My eyes snapped towards the source of the sound. Across the vast expanse of the installation, a section of the concrete wall, thick and reinforced, was warping. It bulged outwards as if an immense pressure was being applied from within. The air around it grew heavy, dense, difficult to breathe. I could feel it, a subtle shift in the very atmosphere, a wrongness that went beyond anything my scientific mind could quantify. A low, guttural moan began to emanate from the distorted section of wall. It wasn't animalistic, not human. It was a sound of immense, ancient suffering, or perhaps immense, ancient hunger. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. I wanted to run, to flee this place and never look back, but a morbid fascination held me captive. My fingers traced the worn metal of the wrench, its weight a constant reminder of my own fragility. The distortion intensified and the groaning deepened. Cracks spiderwebbed across the concrete, not in straight lines but in impossible fractal patterns. Through these cracks I saw it. Not a light but a negation of light. It pulsed. A slow, rhythmic beat that echoed the earlier thrumming but with a terrifying finality. My vision began to swim. The edges of my perception blurred. It felt as though the very reality of this place was fraying, unraveling like old thread. The air tasted of dust and decay and that lingering metallic tang. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the impossible sight, but the image was seared onto my retinas. The tearing. The unmaking. When I opened them again, the groaning had stopped. In its place, a single, obsidian-black shard of something, no larger than my hand, protruded from the fractured concrete. It seemed to absorb all light, all warmth, radiating an aura of utter stillness. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a profound sense of ancient, patient waiting. I stumbled backwards, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The wrench slipped from my numb fingers, clattering loudly on the concrete. The sound was jarring, alien in the profound stillness. I looked around the vast, echoing space of the radio telescope installation. Signal received, not from space. The hulking instruments stood silent, their purpose now irrevocably tainted. Had they always been here, waiting, or had it brought them into being? My investigation had led me here to this impossible breach, this wound in reality. But what had I truly unleashed by finding it? My breath hitched. This wasn't the cold, silent void of space I'd studied for decades. This was, here, close. I forced my eyes away from the pulsing light, away from the shadows that seemed to writhe at the edges of my vision. The signal. It had originated from this derelict radio telescope installation. Signal received, not from space. A wave of nausea washed over me, the sterile metallic tang of the air suddenly thick with something else, something foul and ancient. The hum of the generator, once a comforting drone, now felt like a strained groan against an unseen pressure. I had to see it, had to understand. My hand, slick with sweat, fumbled for the heavy wrench I'd picked up earlier. It felt ridiculously inadequate, a child's toy against whatever was happening. The skittering grew louder, 1,000 tiny claws on metal, on concrete. My boots scraped against the grimy concrete as I moved, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the rising tide of panic. The thrumming intensified, resonating in my chest, making my own heart feel like a fragile thing about to shatter. I reached the base of the massive dish, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the weak emergency lighting. The noise was deafening now, a cacophony of scraping, chittering, and something else. A wet, tearing sound that made my stomach clench. I raised the wrench, my grip tight. Then I saw it. Not a creature, not a being in any sense I understood. It was a convergence. A focal point of impossible geometry, shimmering at the very heart of the dish's rusted armature. It pulsed with the same sickly green light, but this light was different. It didn't illuminate, it devoured. It twisted space, bending the metal around it into shapes that made my mind ache. The skittering wasn't from a multitude of small things. It was one thing, 1,000 tiny manifestations of a single colossal wrongness. It was the sound of reality fraying, of the threads that held existence together snapping under an unbearable strain. The signal hadn't been a message. It had been a wound, a tear in the fabric, and this thing was pouring through. My gaze was fixed on the shimmering distortion. It was drawing me in, a siren song of utter annihilation. It was ancient, impossibly so, existing before stars were born, before the universe had even bothered to form. And it had found this place. It had found me. A sudden, violent jolt ran through the structure. Metal shrieked. The green light flared, blindingly bright for a second, and then nothing. The thrumming stopped. The skittering ceased. My eyes adjusted slowly. The shimmering distortion was gone. Had I driven it back, or had it simply finished? I scanned the armature, my gaze sweeping over the twisted metal. There was a residue, a faint, iridescent film that clung to the surfaces, smelling faintly of ozone and something else. Something like decay and the birth of stars. It was like the ghost of the thing, a stain on reality. I backed away, my legs feeling like lead. The radio telescope installation, signal received not from space, was just a derelict building again, but it wasn't. It would never be again. The knowledge was a physical weight in my gut. The universe wasn't vast and empty. It was vast and full. The stars were still there, indifferent and distant. But now, when I looked at them, I didn't see the comforting patterns of physics. I saw the eyes of something vast and terrible, watching, waiting. The signal was gone, but the echo remained, a permanent scar on my soul. What had I truly seen, and what had it left behind?